The first step in creating a training program is to decide how many times you will train per week. Frequency is essentially just a vehicle for volume. In other words, the total number of sets performed for a muscle group per week. Training more frequently allows you to accumulate more total sets for each muscle group throughout the week, which is generally favorable for muscle growth. This meta-analysis found a positive dose response with volume and hypertrophy. Muscle growth can be achieved even with very low volumes, but higher volumes generally promote greater muscle growth, even up to extreme levels. However, there seems to be somewhat of a diminishing returns response where more volume has less additional benefit. So while more volume may be better, I would recommend training with a frequency that allows you to stick with your routine consistently. If you are willing to put in the time and effort, training more frequently to accumulate more volume is fine. But if you think you won't be able to stick to this routine consistently, then I would recommend opting for a lower training frequency. For our example training program, let's say we are going to train 4 times per week. The exact days we train isn't all that important, as long as all 4 workouts are completed each week. Once we decide how many days per week we will train, the next step is to decide on a training split. This just refers to what muscle groups will be trained on which days. The exact training split we implement isn't really all that important for muscle growth. However, there are a few things to consider when deciding on your split. First is that it may not be ideal to train the same muscle group with high volumes on consecutive days. While it isn't a huge issue, it might cause some overlapping fatigue and inhibit your lifting performance slightly. You will likely adapt to this over time, and it probably won't be an issue after a little while, but it is just something to be aware of. Second is that it may be slightly more effective to train each muscle group at least 2 times throughout the week, rather than only once. Splitting your workload for a muscle group between 2 or more workouts per week seems to be a little better than performing all your work in a single workout. However, splitting your workload between 3 or more workouts per week seems to have almost no detectable additional benefit. This was established in this meta-regression, which found that distributing volume between 2 or more workouts per week seems to be marginally better for muscle growth than performing all your volume in one workout. But higher frequencies than this basically have no detectable additional benefits. And the third consideration for your training split is what muscle groups you want to prioritize. If you train a muscle group more often, it provides more opportunity to accumulate a greater total weekly volume. So your training split may be used to prioritize or de-emphasize certain muscle groups over others. For example, a 5-day training split could train the upper body 3 times per week and the lower body 2 times per week, which would allow more total volume for the upper body. Or we could train the lower body 3 times per week and the upper body twice if we wanted to prioritize leg development. For our example training program, let's implement a push-pull split. So days 1 and 3 will train the chest, front and lateral delts, triceps, quadriceps, and abs. And days 2 and 4 will train the back, rear delts, biceps, hamstrings, and calves. This split allows at least 48 hours before training the same muscle groups again, even if workouts are performed on consecutive days. It also trains each muscle group twice per week, so the total workload is distributed between 2 workouts rather than 1. Once we have our training split established, the next step is to choose exercises for each training session. There aren't necessarily any best or worst exercises to choose, they will all be effective as long as they train the target muscle group. However, there are a few considerations to make when selecting exercises for a training program. First is for the type of exercise you perform. In other words, whether it is a compound, isolation, free weight, or machine-based exercise. Essentially, all exercise types can be highly effective for building muscle. Neither is inherently better or worse in all cases. Each simply has their own unique benefits and limitations. As long as the exercise primarily trains the target muscle group, it is going to be somewhat effective. For example, this study compared training with free weights, including the barbell squat, bench press, prone row, and overhead press, versus machines, including the hack squat, chest press machine, chest supported row machine, and shoulder press machine. It was found that after 8 weeks, cross-sectional area of the pecs, quadriceps, and abs increased to a similar magnitude. So the type of exercise we implement is mostly a matter of context rather than optimality. For example, a beginner might preference machines for their ease of use, whereas someone training from a minimally equipped home gym might rely more on compound free weight and bodyweight exercises. And someone training at a public gym at a time when it is busy might select the exercises that are simply free to use at the time they train. And the other consideration is for how many exercises you implement for each muscle group. Generally, training a muscle group with more than one exercise variant seems to have a slight advantage over performing a single exercise only. This was seen in this study, which compared the effects of training each muscle group with 1 versus 3 different exercises throughout the week. It was found that muscle thickness increased at all sites in both groups, with a slight trend favoring the group implementing more exercise variety. So for muscles you want to prioritize, it may be beneficial to train them with at least 2 exercise variants. And if it is feasible, it may be further beneficial to train such muscles with 3 or more exercise variants. Another consideration falling under the topic of exercise selection is exercise order. In other words, what order we perform each exercise within an individual workout. Generally, it is recommended to perform compound lifts earlier in a workout and isolation lifts later in the workout. The reason being that compound lifts usually require greater physical and psychological effort to perform. So we want to be in the freshest state possible to ensure adequate effort and execution of the compound lifts. Furthermore, isolation lifts can fatigue muscles used in compound lifts, potentially inhibiting the hypertrophic stimulus slightly. For example, this study compared the effects of performing the bench press and/or tricep extensions in different orders. It was found that triceps cross-sectional area increased similarly whether the bench press or tricep extensions were performed first. However, pec growth was slightly inhibited when tricep extensions were performed prior to the bench press. For our example program, here are the exercises we have chosen. Each muscle group is trained with at least 2 different exercise variants, and each workout starts with the more demanding compound lifts and finishes with the less demanding machines and isolation lifts. The next variable to discuss is proximity to failure. This refers to how close to failure each set is taken. We can quantify this using the reps in reserve scale. Failure means we attempted the rep but couldn't complete it. 0 reps in reserve means we completed as many full reps as possible, and if we were to attempt another rep, we would have failed. 1 rep in reserve means we could have performed 1 more full rep. 2 reps in reserve means we could have performed 2 more reps, and so on. So how does proximity to failure influence muscle growth? Well, you don't need to train to complete failure to achieve muscle growth. However, we generally find that training closer to failure results in greater muscle growth. This was established in this meta-regression, which found that muscle growth can be achieved even when training very far from failure, as much as 10 reps in reserve. But training closer to failure generally results in greater muscle growth. Furthermore, how close to failure we train is also determined by how we define failure. Failure is usually defined as the inability to complete the full range of motion. However, some exercises allow us to continue lifting even after full range of motion failure has been reached. And this can sometimes result in even greater muscle growth if implemented appropriately. For example, this study compared the effects of performing standing calf raises to failure using either a full range of motion for every rep or continuing the set until they cannot plant or flex the ankle at all. After 10 weeks, it was found that both groups experienced significant increases in gastrocnemius muscle thickness, with the extended sets seeing a little more growth. So overall, we probably want to train at least fairly close to failure for the purposes of muscle growth, at least 5 reps in reserve. For even greater muscle growth, training very close to failure may be necessary, at least 2 reps in reserve. And to make a set maximally hypertrophic, it may be beneficial to train to complete failure and potentially beyond failure. We may also decide to train a little closer or further from failure depending on the exercise. In general, we typically want to leave a little more in the tank during compound free weight exercises, since it can be highly fatiguing to train very close to failure with these lifts, and it could potentially be a little more risky from a safety perspective. Whereas most machines and isolation lifts can be taken to complete failure most of the time without any significant downsides. In terms of our training program, we don't necessarily need to prescribe proximity to failure explicitly. We can just focus on taking each set close to failure and leave it at that. But if you want to prescribe it, then we would just need to allocate a reps in reserve number or range. In our example program, we have prescribed the following reps in reserve targets. The highly demanding compound free weight lifts are trained a little further from failure. The moderately demanding exercises are trained with about 1 to 2 reps in reserve, while the less demanding isolation lifts are trained closer to failure. The next variable to discuss is reps and load. The reason these variables are combined is because they directly influence each other. Lifting heavier loads means we can't perform as many reps, while lighter loads allow us to perform more reps. In a hypertrophy style training program, we typically prescribe reps rather than load. That way, load can be adjusted to suit the target range based on the specific exercise and the strength level of the individual. So how many reps should we perform for the purposes of muscle growth? Well, it seems that pretty much any rep range is able to produce some degree of hypertrophy, provided that we train fairly close to failure. This was seen in this meta-analysis, which compared the effects of training with heavy loads, defined as an 8 rep max or heavier, moderate loads, defined as a 9 to 15 rep max, or light loads, defined as anything lighter than a 15 rep max. It was found that all load categories were able to produce similar muscle growth, with no significant benefit when comparing heavy versus light, light versus moderate, or moderate versus heavy loads. However, it is possible to train too light where muscle growth can be compromised. It seems that when training with less than around 40% 1RM, which is equivalent to about a 30 to 35 rep max, muscle growth is slightly inhibited. This was observed in this study, which found that training with 20% 1RM resulted in less growth during bicep curl and leg press training compared with using 40, 60, or 80% 1RM loads. Furthermore, it is also possible to train too heavy to maximize muscle growth. It seems that when training with less than around 5 reps, which is equivalent to about 87% 1RM, we might not achieve quite as much muscle growth compared with slightly higher rep ranges. This was observed in this study, which found that training with heavier loads in the 2 to 4 rep range was slightly less effective than training with more moderate loads in the 8 to 12 rep range. So overall, we can probably train anywhere within the approximate 5 to 30 rep range and achieve similar muscle growth, provided that we are training close to failure. However, practically speaking, training with more than around 20 reps probably has minimal utility in most cases. So I'd say the 5 to 20 rep range is a more practical range to stick with. In terms of what rep ranges to prescribe for a training program, we can essentially fall anywhere within this range and achieve similar muscle growth. However, we might decide to lift on the higher or lower end of this range for different exercises. In general, compound free weight lifts are usually better suited to slightly lower rep ranges, while machines and isolation lifts are usually suitable to be trained in the moderate and higher end of the hypertrophy range. Furthermore, you may decide to train with slightly higher rep ranges and therefore lighter loads for some exercises if you find that heavier loads irritate specific joints or connective tissue. In our example training program, here are the rep ranges we have prescribed. For the more challenging compound lifts, we have implemented lower rep ranges. Most exercises fall within moderate rep ranges, while the ab exercises are trained with higher rep ranges. Next, let's discuss rest periods between each set. Essentially, regardless of how long you rest, muscle growth can be achieved. However, very short rest periods might be a little inferior for muscle growth on a per set basis. This was established in this meta-analysis, which compared the effects of short rest, defined as 1 minute or less, moderate rest, defined as 1 to 2 minutes, long rest, defined as 2 to 3 minutes, or very long rest, defined as 3 minutes or longer. Overall, significant muscle growth was observed with all rest period durations. However, moderate and longer rest periods seem to be a little more favorable than short rest. So although short rest periods may be a little less effective on a per set basis, they are more time efficient. By limiting rest periods, you are able to complete more total sets in the same time frame, potentially resulting in a superior overall hypertrophic stimulus. Or you could complete the same number of sets within a shorter time frame for a shorter overall workout. For some practical recommendations, I'd say that training anywhere between around 1 to 3 minutes seems to be a reasonable rest period duration for most exercises. If you want to maximize time efficiency, resting for shorter durations of around 90 seconds or less is a better option. But if you want to maximize the per set stimulus, then slightly longer rest periods of at least 2 minutes may be necessary. Furthermore, you might rest a little longer for more fatiguing exercises such as squat and deadlift variations. And you might rest a little shorter for less fatiguing exercises like bicep curls or calf raises. In our example training program, we have implemented the following rest period durations. Slightly longer rest periods are prescribed for the more demanding exercises. Most exercises are permitted around 1.5 to 2 minutes rest, and some isolation lifts are permitted only 1 minute rest. And the last variable to prescribe in our training program are sets. The number of sets an exercise is trained with can be viewed as one contributor to volume, meaning the total number of sets a muscle group is trained with per week. Volume is a product of 3 individual factors: the number of workouts performed per week, the number of exercises a muscle group is trained with, and the number of sets performed for each exercise. Increasing or decreasing any of these variables can impact how much volume a muscle is trained with. In our example training program, let's take a muscle group such as the back for example. The back is trained with 3 exercises throughout the week. If we were to perform 3 sets for each exercise, our total volume would be 9 sets for the back muscle group. If we were to perform 2 sets of each exercise, our total volume would be 6 sets. And if we were to perform 4 sets per exercise, our total volume would be 12 sets. So how many sets should we perform for each exercise? Well, in general, more sets is usually going to be beneficial because it results in a higher total weekly volume. And as mentioned earlier, training a muscle with more volume seems to be better for hypertrophy with somewhat of a diminishing returns relationship. However, we can't just perform infinite sets because there are practical limitations. More sets means more time and effort needs to be put into training within an individual workout and throughout the entire week. So here are some practical guidelines to help decide how many sets you should perform for each exercise. Within an individual workout, performing around 15 to 25 total sets from all exercises is a decent starting point. This is going to allow a good amount of work to be performed within an individual workout without taking too much time and effort. Taking this approximate set range into consideration, we can then distribute this between the exercises planned in the workout. Usually this will result in performing 3 to 4 sets for most exercises. And third is that we can perform more or less sets for different exercises depending on your priorities. For high priority muscles, you may want to perform more sets to accumulate a greater weekly volume, while low priority muscles might be trained with fewer sets, resulting in a lower total weekly volume. In our example training program, we could perform 3 to 4 sets for all exercises. This would result in 18 to 24 sets performed within each individual workout, and would result in a fairly balanced volume distribution between muscles. Alternatively, if we wanted to prioritize the upper body, we could increase sets to 4 for all upper body exercises and reduce lower body exercises to 2 sets. Or if we wanted to prioritize the lower body, we could increase sets to 4 for each lower body exercise and decrease upper body exercises to 2 sets. For this example, let's stick with a balanced volume distribution, training all exercises with 3 sets each. Now that we have completed our training program, the final step is to discuss progressive overload. This is the concept of making training more challenging over time. This is required to continue providing an effective training stimulus to adapt to. If we perform the exact same weekly workouts over time, we would fail to continue adapting and would just maintain our current level of muscle mass. So how do we progress training for the purposes of hypertrophy? Well, there are many ways to do so, but the primary method is by increasing reps and load over time. A simple method is to do more reps whenever possible. And if you exceed the top of the planned rep range, then you can increase load for the following week and repeat. For example, let's take the bench press in our training program. Let's say we performed 50 kilograms for 8, 7, then 6 reps for 3 sets respectively. Over the next few weeks, we are able to add reps until we achieved 11 reps on our first set, which exceeds our target rep range. So the following week, load is increased to 55 kilograms, resulting in less reps being performed. Then we can add reps again over time until reaching the top of the range before increasing load, and so on. The rate at which you are able to progress will be dependent on several factors. Most notably, your training status will determine how fast you are able to add reps and load. Beginners can usually progress in some form every time they repeat the same workout, whereas advanced lifters may not experience true performance progression for several months or even years. Furthermore, it should be noted that we don't necessarily want to increase reps and load at the expense of technique. Adding reps and load as a result of being less controlled isn't really considered true progression. This may compromise the overall hypertrophic stimulus of the set rather than making it more stimulative like we want it to. Lifting heavier than you can control can also increase joint stress, increasing the likelihood of joint or connective tissue pain or injury. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Check out flowhighperformance.com for online coaching, training templates, ebooks, and more.